Welcome to Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Centre for Policy Research. On this programme, we discuss ideas, solutions to issues, and bringing our thoughts to action. My name's Tim Wilson. For more on the London Centre for Policy Research, who we are and what we do, visit our website at londoncentre.org. And please follow us on the London Centre's Twitter page at the LCPR, or our Facebook page, the London Centre, or social media, Rumble, YouTube. And if you'd like to help us create more content like this and enjoy future exclusive versions of special content, we welcome you to become part of our Patreon community at patreon.com/thoughttoaction. Also, feel free to share this video and comment on our discussion. We appreciate your helping us to spread the word about our program and conversations, and we appreciate your input. Today on Thought to Action, we welcome Ambassador Henry Cooper. Hank is an Air Force veteran, the chairman of High Frontier, which is a non-profit dedicated to defending America against missile attack. He has a bachelor's and master's in science from Clemson and his doctorate from NYU. He was, simplifying here, President Reagan's Star Wars expert and director of such under President Bush. We're also lucky to have him on the board of directors of the London Centre. Hi, Hank.
Good to be with you, Tim.
So today's topic, you've been writing a great deal over the time, and we at the London Centre are very focused on weaknesses in supply chains. One of the most, or possibly the most critical supply chain of all is electricity to the country. And you've done a great deal of research into possible weaknesses in the whole thing. Would you like to give just a quick outline of your thinking on the vulnerabilities there?
Well, most people don't realize how dependent they are on electricity until they lose it. And the folks in Texas learned that last February due to an ice storm that basically shut off the electricity for several days, and they were without heat and most of the essentials of life. Now, they made it through because they had folks that could help them from outside. And but they learned, I hope, a lesson out of all that because they had given up on protecting significant portions of their grid. And it turned out that bad weather took out, unusually bad weather took out the remaining part upon which they were totally dependent. Now, we are totally dependent on the grid across the country. Without it, we don't get water, we don't get medicine, hospitals stop working, the security community that we depend on, we lose them because we lose the communication and in many ways the transportation. So it's a major disaster if we were to lose the entire electric grid. That unfortunately is a possible happening, not just to limited sections like we saw in Texas and have observed in other places as well, earlier times when the whole Northeast was blocked out. For example, I forget exactly what year, but over a decade ago, because a tree branch fell in Ohio and knocked off a portion of the grid, and the entire Northeast lost its grid for a significant period of time. So it doesn't take enormous threats. One of these days, we're going to get a major solar flare that intersects the Earth's orbit when we're in the location and it transpires for us. The last time that happened was in 1859. And at that time, we were not dependent on electricity. Folks were growing on all their own food. And they, of course, hardly noticed what happened. They kept lighting the candles and the lights as they were normal to. They lost the telegraph at the time. That was what was being used for communication. If that were to happen today, and it's going to happen someday, it's just we don't know when. If it were to happen today, it would be catastrophic. Now, you would think that the government would take care to deal with this issue, particularly the Department of Energy, which is responsible for much of the not only the operations of the grid and overseeing it, but the regulations. But what I discovered when I started digging into this a year or so ago was that our regulatory system in Washington really does not have the authority to deal with the distribution grid, which is the wires that everybody sees that runs to their home, runs to their businesses, runs to the fire department, runs to the local governments, runs to the hospital, and so on. That's called a distribution grid. And it is vulnerable all over. We know how to deal with this vulnerability from all manner of threats. The most catastrophic potentially is called electromagnetic pulse, EMP, which is created by natural means by the solar incident I just described, or by man-made means if a nuclear weapon is detonated at high altitude. When I was just a young buck, I was working at Bell Telephone Laboratories, and I worked on a satellite system called Telstar. It was the first telecommunication system. I took my wife in to watch the first TV that was a show that was transferred from in Paris, I forget the name of the town now, just outside of Paris, into Rumford, Maine. And the first thing up was the Star Spangled Banner and our flag. And we were all proud of that. But it turned out that at the same time, approximately, we detonated a nuclear weapon in the South Pacific. Turned out the lights in Hawaii at the time, and if there were modern electronics there, it would have been a catastrophe for Hawaii. But it was okay for them, but it also caused my Telstar system to be lost, as
was
well
that
as
was that the Starfish Prime test, Hank?
It was Starfish Prime in 1962.
Just so people know, there are pictures of that on the internet. You can see, you know, what happened.
Right. Well, what I was going to say is at the time, as part of what people should understand, the subject became very classified because all of our important strategic systems, our satellite systems that kept the president informed, the communication systems to our strategic forces, our Minuteman, our submarine launch systems, our bombers, the president's aircraft, and so on, they were all vulnerable. And so everything became super secret, and we took care of that problem over the next decade, I suppose. And but it remained very secret, and the private sector was not aware or did not make itself aware of what the issues were. And so the electric power grid was not protected,
Right.
nor our other communication systems.
Right.
And that has persisted to this day. We know how to address the problem. We know how, and we've demonstrated on some programs that I've led here in South Carolina, that it's not terribly expensive to do so, something like $100 one-time cost per citizen of a county that we looked at. But the federal government's not doing anything to help us make this thing happen.
Right.
And, you know, that's a one-time cost. I took my wife out for dinner last week a couple of times. I spent $200. And that's, you know, it just shows you this is affordable. Our problems are bureaucratic and whatever you want to call the lethargy in Washington.
If I may on that, Hank, I mean, I'd just like to recap a little bit and point out that what you're saying is that back in the late 50s, early 60s, we discovered that electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear device could give us enormous nationwide problems,
Yes.
particularly at that time in defense, but still true today. We've also learned more and more since then about this geomagnetic disturbance caused by coronal mass ejections, for example, which are a naturally occurring electromagnetic pulse effectively. And if I'm right, what you're saying is that although there are potential solutions, and we've known about this for a long, long time, decades, government inertia and government inefficiency means that we are still vulnerable to that type of major event, which I would also just like to point out, as you say, if the electricity grid goes out, there are all sorts of little effects that people don't think of. So many of our businesses now run on computers. The computers won't be available. The internet won't be available. The phones probably won't be available. And so many of our supply chains, going right back to the origins of where we started about talking about all of this, are just-in-time supply chains that depend on computers organizing what moves when and where it moves. So even things like truck transport are going to be stuck not having the loads they need to keep the country fed, warm, sheltered, and all the rest of it.
Absolutely. And this is, I think it's unforgivable in the hands of our leadership in Washington. As you know, I wrote an article about that last week in Newsmax, and it's on the London Center's webpage, along with several others that I would encourage people to read as background. And don't think I'm a heretic and a wow man on these issues. I've worked on them. When I was running the SDI program that you mentioned, I actually, out of my own initiative, took $500 million out of my budget and sent it to the Defense Nuclear Agency so that they could develop an independent set of authorities and do assessments of the military systems, the defense systems we were building. I don't know whether that's been maintained. And frankly, if you don't maintain a system in a hardened configuration, then it can be disrupted in simple, straightforward ways. So that's the problem too.
Yeah, if I may on that, there's two little points I'd like to slide in there about that. One is that we've had private industry in very few areas have done the odd item towards it, including you sort of slid past large power transformers, which are key items of which there's only a few hundred in the country, and they are key in the distribution of electricity from the generating point to the public. And we've actually had one of those large power generators donated for research to the government, and yet they haven't even managed to get it to where it needs to be.
That's correct. That's in North Charleston here in South Carolina, and it was Duke Energy that gave that transformer to them. And Duke has been our partner since the beginning in York County, South Carolina, project we call the Lake Wiley Pilot Study, where we've done these assessments of the distribution grid. And Duke operates 3 major power plants on Lake Wiley. And so we've been partnering with them now for well over 5 years. And we've been waiting, we've demonstrated, actually had a detailed assessment and cost estimate put together, and have been trying to get support to actually carry the hardening out in York County, to validate it and to develop a plan for moving it throughout the state of South and North Carolina and throughout the nation. And Washington is intent on throwing just money at all sorts of things. But in these related issues, unfortunately, the Department of Energy thinks it has to reinvent what we learned how to do decades ago in the Department of Defense that I described to you earlier. We know how to address this problem technically, or at least there's some old gray-haired people that do. And that can be learned without reinventing everything, which is what the DOE labs have a tendency to do.
I get it completely. I have read many of your articles over the years, actually, and there are quite a number linked on our site at thelondoncenter.org. But you also have some up at the High Frontier, and Newsmax has been running recently a fairly steady series by you on these issues and the criticality of them. Let me just to bring it back to the government inefficiency and the big picture. You talked about it would only be $100 a head, basically, to fix the thing down at the bottom end. And up at the top end, these large power transformers, for example, I gather that we're only talking, again, a relatively small sum. Now, for the individual, billions are a lot, but a few billion would sort this whole thing out pretty much, would it not?
I think so. And frankly, I'm discouraged, frustrated. Here you have Washington arguing about trillions of dollars on various and sundry things that they call infrastructure. And at least in the Senate, I think they've been more careful about the infrastructure. It mostly is infrastructure. But if you look at the 1.2 trillion that they have decided. I think the gang of 10 or so believe they're going to close on that this week in the Senate. If you looked at carefully what's there, there's 73 billion out of the 1.3 trillion, you can do the arithmetic, that's associated with, as the Washington Times describes it, decarbonizing the grid, which means building new systems that depend on solar and wind power and all that sort of thing. And there's not much, if anything, that I've been able to find yet to fix our existing system, which we're going to have no matter what else we do for decades to come. So it's really frustrating from where I sit to watch what's going on.
Absolutely. Basically, what you're describing is that they're planning to green the grid without bothering to protect the grid.
That's correct.
Hank Cooper, I think that's been magical. Let's do more of this and in more detail again in the future if we can, but I think we should leave it there for now. Hank Cooper, thank you so much. It's always great talking with you. And ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to go to Newsmax and read his latest articles on this. Go to his High Frontier website, which is really interesting stuff. And of course, you can find out much more on the londoncentre.org website. I'm Tim Wilson. This has been the Herb London Centre for Policy Research's Thought to Action series. Please follow us on patreon.com/thought to action. Please follow us on social media and give us a like and spread the word. We enjoy doing this. It's important. It could make a difference to your lives as well as ours. Please help us out. Thank you very much.